Are humans inherently good or evil? Are we destined to one day finally all kill each other and be the demise of our own species? Or are we innately loving beings that have just been socialized into a system which breeds depravity and bloodshed? These are questions that I know the answers to, but I won't say them because it would render the entire purpose of philosophy meaningless and no one would have anything to do for the rest of time. This is genuinely one question people don't seem to be able to agree on an answer to. Are humans good? Are humans bad? Which way does the penny fall? Is it in our nature to just destroy everything we touch? Can we not help it? Is that what we were put on this planet to do? Or are we perhaps a genuinely benevolent force in the universe who have just been steered down the wrong path for mostly the entirety of human history by leaders who represent the absolute worst of us? As an unjustifiable optimist, I have faith that humans are really good. This is an interesting claim to make, seeing as I study the past. I'm an archaeologist. You're just confronted with all the mistakes that humanity has ever made and the ways in which it's just unable to learn from these mistakes repeatedly, time and time again. A lot of history is marred by pain and suffering, which continues into the present. But sometimes I find pockets of history which make me believe that humans were put on this earth to love and care for each other. And I'd like to focus on that today, if you'll permit me. Sorry, the sun is kind of just going to be chilling there for a while, so I hope you don't mind that he's there. If you have a problem with it, take it up with the gravitational pull of the earth. I don't know, he's going to be there. He enjoys listening to me talk. A relatively new lens through which to view the field of archaeology is something entitled Bioarchaeology of Care. There are horror stories of how disabled people were treated and dealt with in the past. You hear that babies were left on cliffs to die, or that people were aggressively exorcised to bring demons out of them that were sicked on them by an angry god. Stories like this often come from places of fear and the notion that everything humans do somehow has to contribute to this linear, infinitely expansive view of evolution, and that any deviation from this couldn't possibly have happened in the past, as it would have been of no benefit to our early ancestors. This idea of evolution is wrong in so many ways, and especially horrifying when brought up in the context of people with disabilities, as if humans are incapable of care, as if there's no point to being alive if you don't fit the physical norm, which has obviously changed drastically throughout our millions of years stint on this planet. Darwin dropped the phrase survival of the fittest back in 1869, and I feel like I've been doing damage control ever since. There have in fact been many, many examples of humans in the past, from as early as 10,000 years ago, caring for their disabled population. So maybe violence is innate in humankind, but so is love. The Bioarchaeology of Care framework was first introduced by an Australian archaeologist, Lorna Tilley, after her discovery and excavation of a profoundly ill young man who lived 4,000 years ago in what is now northern Vietnam, and was buried, as were others in his culture, in a burial site known as Man Bac. In essence, it's a contextualized approach for interpreting the experience of disability in healthcare based on physical evidence for disease found in human remains. So between 3,700 and 4,000 years ago, in North Vietnam, the young man found in Man Bac Burial 9 survived into his 30s with severe disabilities, which would have left him paralyzed from adolescence onwards. Man Bac Burial 9, affectionately dubbed M9, lived during the Neolithic with a severe case of a congenital disease known as Klippel-Feil syndrome, which would have left him with at the very least paraplegia and at the most almost complete paralysis. Despite the limited healthcare facilities available to him in 2000 BC Vietnam, the people around him, who had no metal and lived by fishing and hunting and raising barely domesticated pigs, took the time and care to tend to his every need. At the most basic level, M9 would have had assistance with the bare necessities of staying alive. He would have had to have been given food and water and shelter and transport and help with dressing. And on a more advanced level, it's clear that he would have had help maintaining his hygiene and comfort levels, as he wouldn't have survived very long without those being met. The more advanced ongoing care, which would have been going on for 10 plus years after he became completely paralyzed, is far more intimate and far more labor intensive, and would have demanded a higher level of skill and or commitment from his community. This would have involved a regular routine of bathing, which would have been fundamental to his survival to stop further infections from his disability. He also would have required constant supervision. Looking at his skeleton, we know that he had intense spinal cord damage, and this would have left him with quite a drastic lack of sensation in his body. So he wouldn't really have been aware if he was ever in pain, meaning he wouldn't really be aware if he was in danger. That's what pain is for. In Neolithic Vietnam, he would have been exposed to open fires, poisonous insects, any number of things that could go wrong when you live in close proximity to others. M9's community not only needed to know where he was at any given time, but where he was in relation to potential dangers that they would have been facing. They would have monitored him regularly to make sure nothing was wrong. Constant checkups and checking his body for infections or cuts or abrasions. We don't know the level of knowledge that this Neolithic Vietnamese community had on what could have helped M9 be more comfortable in his life. But we do know that in order for him to survive as long as he did, they must have continuously moved him and bathed him, massaged him even. If someone in his condition didn't receive proper care like this, it would have showed up in his bones. Pressure sores from being in the same place for too long and bone fractures from infections and disease would be obvious looking at his skeleton, but M9 has none. There's also further evidence at this site, although not particularly on M9, for use of herbal remedies that assisted with pain and fever. M9 was buried with his contemporaries in the Manback Cemetery, but in a distinctly different position. With the typical patterns for burials in this site, the deceased are interned laying straight, while M9 was buried curled in the fetal position, maybe an outcome of limitations imposed on him by his physical disabilities in life. We can never know exactly how the Manback Society understood illness and how this may have affected the decision to care for M9, but it's plain to see that he was cared for well and for a long time, and that he was loved. In a small society which was very stressed, that means somebody who couldn't contribute or go out hunting or undertake a lot of tasks was supported, accommodated, and adjusted to. That tells us people mattered, they were valued. Not only does his care indicate tolerance and cooperation of his disabilities in his culture, but it also suggests that he had a sense of his own self-worth and a strong desire to keep living. Without that, he wouldn't have stayed alive. Okay, one of my most favorite moments from the Paleolithic, and not just because it concerns my favorite hominid species, Neanderthals, is the case of Shanidar 1. In a cave in the north of what is now Iraq, 45,000 years ago, lived a group of Neanderthals, one of which was a man of about 50, with one arm amputated, loss of vision in one eye, a bad limp, and partially deaf. Bro was really going through it, but he wasn't going through it alone. At a young age, Shanidar 1 would have experienced an extreme blow to the head, essentially blinding him completely in one eye and permanently damaging the brain area controlling the right side of his body, leading to a withered right arm and possible paralysis that also crippled his right leg. None of the many injuries that are present in his skeletal remains were the cause of his death. And he had so many. And Shanidar 1 lived to a relatively old age for Neanderthal standards. He would, however, not have even come close to reaching this age if it weren't for the help of his community. His deafness and blindness especially would have made him extremely vulnerable to predatory animals and the myriad of other dangers around him in his Paleolithic lifestyle. Research concluded that Shanidar 1 must have had significant help from his community to make it to the age that he did. His community didn't see his handicaps as something that should exclude him from their lifestyle. Rather, it's more likely that they just adapted as a group to fit his needs. It's been suggested that he was perhaps a very high status individual, but there's also the chance that he wasn't, and he was just adapted for because he was an individual in this community. I'll leave you with a final example, which is my favorite example of the bioarchaeology of care. It's the case of Romito II, a teenage boy found in a site in Italy dating back 10,000 years ago. Romito had a severe case of dwarfism, the earliest known case of its kind, in fact. Romito's skeletal dysplasia limited his participation in the typical day-to-day affairs and other cultural activities undertaken by his cohort. And the difference in his appearance would have been very obvious to his peers from birth. While he wouldn't have needed constant assistance to survive, like M9, his community would have had to come to terms with the fact that in this subsistence economy where one lives a nomadic lifestyle, hunting and gathering, he just would not have been able to keep up with them. He would not have been able to hunt for himself. Essentially, he wouldn't have really been able to pull his own weight in this environment. His condition would have led to massive constraints on his agility and speed and endurance, and this would make tracking prey over steep and irregular terrain virtually impossible for him. Forearm and hand limitations also would have made it quite difficult for him to use any weapons at all. As an infant, Romito would have needed more attention than any of his other peers. His developmental delays would have demanded a lot from his caregivers, and clearly they were willing to provide this for him, and they were willing to give him the extra time that he needed. In a society where survival depended on active participation from every member, accommodating Romito II's needs required quite a shift in the standard of the group at this time. It would have been obvious from birth that Romito was different, and this probably brought up a lot of uncertainties about his future, about his mobility and capabilities, and what he would be able to provide to the group as he got older. However, we know that he was a part of this community well into his teenage years, and it's likely that the group rallied around him and supported him as he grew. As Romito II reached adolescence, the community's accommodation of his physical difference would have become more and more obvious, and their adjustment towards him went far beyond just mere provision of care. It was a profound shift in the way the group viewed its own dynamics. To me, one of the most intriguing aspects of Romito II's care was provisioning. Despite his inability to contribute directly to the food production of the community, he shared in the same meat-rich diet as the group. He was provided for. Meeting Romito II's needs would have required the cooperation and resourcefulness of the entire group. It wouldn't have been just one person looking after him, making sure he was fed, making sure everything was provided for. The entire group would have had to rally around him for him to be able to survive. Rather than being defined by his differences, his identity was shaped by being a member of the community. His social integration is very evident through the respectful treatment that he received in death. Romito II was found buried in an embrace with a woman, estimated to be between 35 to 50 years old. He lies in the hollow of her left shoulder, with her left arm around his left shoulder and upper body. It's possible that this woman could be his mother, given that he was between 17 to 20 at the time of his death, but this has yet to be proved. The woman's short stature and similar cranial traits do suggest that the two are related, but no genetic testing has been done at this time. Regardless of who these two were to each other, though, it's clear that they love each other in death as they may have in life. As Lorna Tilley gracefully put it, from the very earliest times, we can see evidence that people who were unable to function were helped, looked after, and given what care was available. So while it may be a tale as old as time, that humans have always been resigned to hurt each other, so too it seems they have always found the need to care for each other to survive. The son has departed. I guess he kind of heard enough. He's seen it all anyway, so he doesn't need me telling him what's going on. Thanks and bye.